Okay, so we're gathered for another sculpture forum, and this time we gathered in person, and I'm with the usual Jock Ireland, thank you Jock, and Brandt Junceau, thank you Brandt, and this time we're honoured to have with us Michael Brenson, distinguished critic, curator, author, recently published the definitive biography of David Smith, perhaps the most important American sculptor. Anyway, we're here to discuss a book, or perhaps two books, and I will briefly describe the project that these books document. It begins in 1972 with a project in Great Britain that placed, I think, 16 sculptures in 8 cities across the country, all outside of the metropolitan capital. Contemporary sculptors, and after some process of selection, I ended up putting a very large steel sculpture in the city of Cardiff, or close to where I have some roots. And the day after it was installed, I went out with a tape recorder and asked people what they thought of it without identifying myself as its author or even referring to it as a sculpture. That recording began to have a bit of a life of its own. I used it in another sculpture. I had it transcribed, and then I more or less forgot about it. Many, many years later, it's a rather complicated story. Anyway, it got published by Soberscope Press in a small volume, which I contextualized with a couple of essays, and John Wood wrote an essay for that book. John Wood was then the head of research at the Henry Moore Institute. During the preparation of that 1970, the book that documents the 1972 recording, I began to wonder about the sculpture, because the project had arranged that the cities would host the works for 6 months. And at the end of the 6 months, the cities could acquire them, I guess depending on what, I'm not sure, but presumably some kind of public reaction. Otherwise, they would revert to the ownership of the artists. I had no idea what happened to my sculpture after the 6 months. And that in itself began to be something of interest, like why had I just forgotten about it? I began to think about, I began to have the fantasy really, and it was pure fantasy, about finding it. And initially I thought I would borrow it from whoever owned it and take it back to Cardiff and make another recording, what would be close to 50 years later. And it was pure fantasy initially, but when I discussed the idea with people, they got very interested. And anyway, to cut a long story short, eventually I did manage to recover the sculpture and take it back to Cardiff and make another recording. And that's then documented in a companion volume, which is patterned after the first 1972 Cardiff tapes. So we have the 1972 Cardiff tapes, and the Cardiff tapes 2019, and the more recent 2019 Cardiff tapes includes an essay by the British historian Anne Compton, in which she really kind of, I think, discusses 2 other projects which were reenactments. She considers, or seems to think of, returning my sculpture to Cardiff as a reenact, and making another recording as a reenactment. And the 2 other projects she discusses kind of makes comparisons with a reenactment of a exhibition of interactive sculpture objects by Robert Morris in London, first at the Tate, at the Tate Britain, and then at the Tate Modern it was reenacted, and a project called Luna Park, which had a very, very large constructed dinosaur in I think it was the city of Plymouth. I need to check that. Which happened, which as a result of some mysterious accident got burnt down, and the people, the residents, had become so fond of it that they raised money to create a small memorial to it. So anyway, that we're here to discuss this. I guess the book, the project, whatever you want. And I just open it up at this point, unless you have any factual questions first, maybe. Guys, anybody? No?
Funny that she made it reenactment, no?
Well, I think Anne, dealt with it largely in those terms. Yes.
Well, I think she calls it like a redisplay, no?
Yeah.
Because I think of reenactment as a performative element. Taking an old performance and redoing it. So redisplay felt to me like maybe the more appropriate word, but I don't know if it really matters, because it is a kind of reenactment too. And I mean, I could just say as a general statement that I think it's a great project. And it's fascinating to me because it's, where it began in 1972 and where it ended up, and now you couldn't have imagined that. And so it's a project that in fact unfolded over 50 years, and it's a project that has embedded within it a certain history of sculpture and history of public art, but also your life. Your work, and the Garth Evans of 2019 is not the Garth Evans of 1972, and you embrace that, and you really sort of want that to be part of the work. And so this is for me a conversation I'm really looking forward to having, as much about the work and as much about the history of public sculpture and reception, but also about your changing attitude and for me, your changing language, what you needed the work to be then, and what you need to be, what you need it to be now, and where it finally wound up, because it does have a home. But the idea of a home for that work in 1972 would have been antithetical to the work almost, because it was a kind of work that wasn't going to fit or really belong anywhere. So I just think the trajectory of the work is really fascinating, and these two books, the way they outline that trajectory and make it possible to really dig into it. I find the whole thing really an interesting project to be part of.
Well, thank you, Michael. That's wonderful. I should perhaps add that, as Michael just indicated, the sculpture has now been given by me to the University of South Wales, and is located at their Pontypridd campus, where it sits rather nicely outside of what is a very handsome red brick building, some distance from it, but that is the background to it. And the Pontypridd campus was originally the College of Mining in South Wales, so it seems very appropriate.
I like the way that it used to interfere with the street, that it's baseless and it stands in the way like another pedestrian.
Well, in its original setting, the location that I chose, we were invited by the organisers of the 1972 project, but a sort of crossroads really between a rather well-to-do shopping area and a really scruffy part of town. In that location, it was clearly out of place. It was like something that had come from Mars. We put it back in the same place, but the place is totally different, and I would not put it there now because it was just inappropriate. It was crowded, and I wouldn't. So, but nevertheless, we did manage to get permission to put it back where it was. The very first meeting I had in Cardiff the Cardiff has a visual arts officer, and she joined us at that meeting, and I nearly fell off my chair when she said, well, of course, we don't own that part of the city anymore. You know, the city, as a number of cities in Great Britain have sold off a chunk of themselves to developers.
Wow.
So this is now a whole massive kind of shopping area.
Well, I like the distinction you made between the work not fitting in 1972 in a kind of productive refusal to fit in, and then your sense of it in 2019 is simply being out of place. And being out of place in a way that didn't make sense to you anymore.
Are you happy with the where it is now?
Yes, I did. I managed to get over to Great Britain in, I think it was June or July this past year, and get to Pontypridd and have a meeting there with the people and have a look at it and discuss one or two details. Get them to move a little tree that was going to grow and to be trimmed.
But you don't feel it's been kind of put to sleep in a way that it wasn't in 1972?
Well, that's an interesting observation. I mean, yes, to some extent. I mean, and I think I've put it to sleep too, you know, in my mind. I hope that now that the history of it and my thoughts about it, which I had not disclosed prior to the publication of this first book, will become part of it, and that it will become part of that community, that academic community, and perhaps even be cherished by them in some way, you know.
But I think you're implying, I mean, the work when it was put in, it had this resistance built in. It had an untamed quality. Like whatever it is, it was really not gonna fit in, and it was not gonna accommodate itself. Like it had a certain wildness in relation to its site. And now, you know, where it is in this context of mining, it's a sculpture. It's a sort of modern sculpture that has a place there, that seems to have a permanent place. It makes sense. So like the bristling, like defiance that it almost had at its beginning is gone. So it is, you know, it's another sculpture now.
Yeah, that. But the books are difficult, or at least I found them.
What was difficult?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say. I spent yesterday struggling to figure out what my problem is with the books. You know, the books are very straightforward, insistently straightforward, but I sort of came to the kind of tentative conclusion that you don't really understand what was going on, and you're trying to understand, in a you know, just by sort of setting down the facts and just the facts, and thereby trying to understand this business. What is a sculpture? What's a kind of relationship does a sculpture have with something called the public? But there are two books. You couldn't. The first book didn't sort of solve the problem for you, and so you went and wrote another book, or put together another book that's almost the same, but you still don't understand, or there's still something unresolved and resistant, irritating in the way that the 72 version of the sculpture And well, that was something that sort of made my day yesterday sort of miserable, but it's also the source of its interest, of it, the vital. There's something, you know, I was miserable in a way, but I felt I was learning something.
Well, I'm sorry for making your day miserable.
Yeah.
Let me respond.
Yeah.
You say there's something I don't understand, and that the books reveal me in some way, you know, trying to come to terms with. Somebody recently made the observation in my studio that this was in response to the work that was being looked at. Your sculpture, Garth, does not assume that there is a place for sculpture in the world.
Yeah.
And my immediate response was, well, there isn't. Or really, you know, if I gave it a little more elaborate thought, the place for sculpture in the world is not a place I'm comfortable in or with, or, you know. And yes, so then, I mean, I guess in '72 there was this project. There was another commission for a big sculpture in Ebbw Vale in South Wales, which never got made, unfortunately. And I think at that point I was uncomfortable, as I talk about in the book. And I think I was kind of vaguely sort of wondering, well, if I made public sculpture, would that somehow, you know, relieve my discomfort? You know, would that, you know, making sculptures for particular places, particular communities, would that somehow, you know? No, it didn't. I don't know whether, you know, I didn't accept or attempt to make another public sculpture until very recently. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a problem. I think it's a major problem that there isn't a place for sculpture in the world that is appropriate.
I kind of hear I mean, I'm interested in your defining more, were you the sense of your resolution. Like I hear your question in a somewhat different way, although it might be connected to that. Like for me, there is a pretty strong element of surrealism in that original sculpture, and I mean you define it essentially as a found object. You took the other sculpture apart. It's a leg sitting on a bench. It's something you made, but then you found, and you say your language is, you know, I found it, and the language around it, including the word enigma, which for me, you know, kind of goes back to De Chirico and John Graham, but it has a surrealist resonance to it, so that there is a sense at the beginning that there's something about your unconscious. There's a kind of unconscious in this work. And something is at play that you don't know yourself. You don't know what it is. You know that there's a buried history here. You know that there's a history that's related to your own past, that's somehow connected to the tragedies of mining. So that I think there's also a kind of mourning that's built into this work, but you don't know, but you don't want it to be a memorial, so you're not really sure what to do with it. So that there's all this stuff that's part of the language of the work, part of the way it's made, and then you left the work, you know, which is a big thing. You went to the United States and you abandoned it, and you talk about that, and I'm kind of moved by that. You're trying to understand why you just left it and why you stopped thinking about it, and then you need to go back and you need to understand your relationship to the work, so that there's so much that's going on in that work that has an element of the unconscious and the psychoanalytical or whatever that you're trying to get at later on. And I think actually that Garth does pretty well in articulating what went on, you know, and what happened to the work for him and what it means for him. So I really am interested in your, you know, elaborating on it. And then it's very clear you need a completely different kind of language, like the language that you're using to talk about the work, and I suspect the language you're using to talk about yourself in 2019 or 2023 is very different than the language in 1972. So that the work then, it becomes, the books become this process of exploration, this process of digging. I mean, the word buried is used in the book. You know, Anne uses the word hidden, these hidden histories. This is all part of surrealism in a psychoanalytic language for me. So it becomes this voyage of discovery, and then where you are in 2023 is in such a different place than you were in 1972. And I find, you know, I find this self, because it's a self journey, you know, too, as well as what you're talking about in the language of sculpture. I find it quite moving, and I'm really interested, Jock, if you know, if you can go further with your sense of where the irresolution is for you.
Well, it's you're both have touched on it, but there's there's it. Well, I just struggled with this yesterday, and it was Bruce Gagne's birthday yesterday, and he sent me an email. Bruce Gagne being another sculptor who worked with Garth at the studio school for 30 years, you know, a long time relationship. Garth and Bruce have had a long relationship, that I think it's fair to say they're friends, but they're also big differences. And over the 30 years, I've watched them sort of be on the verge of strangling each other. But he's another sculptor, sort of similar in kind of. There's no place for Bruce's work in today's world. Just in a similar way, it's hard to find a place for Garth's work. Anyway, I exchanged sort of birthday wishes with Bruce, and he's 82 now. And I said something like, you know, put all of your 82 years into your next sculpture. And he wrote back. And Bruce is not a guy that would ever think of writing a book like the books that Garth wrote. He doesn't work rationally, naturally. And it's interesting that Michael sees a surrealistic dimension in Garth's sculpture, but
in this particular sculpture,
yeah,
for sure, yeah.
But there's sort of much more of a direct, or Bruce is, I can, you know, oversimplifying, Garth is rational. Garth is capable of writing, you know, clear sentence after clear sentence. Bruce is not that way, but he sent me an email about what did he say here? Oh no, I ripped up the email and I brought the wrong half. So anyway, well, that doesn't matter. The thing is, he said, or what he said was, he was talking about sort of a recent discovery of his, and the discovery had involved the self, and Bruce said that he, you know, sort of all his life he'd been trying to find himself in his work. And he'd been reading Hannah Arendt and found that that was a mistake. Or Hannah Arendt said that and Bruce had a nice, awkward way of talking about it. But he essentially talks about the differences or the sense in which working involves the self, but it also involves everybody else, the other, non-self, gets engaged. And Bruce said that, talked about this as a kind of discovery, that he says the solitary or the single self is, or the pure self is a phantom, that anything important or anything that matters involves both the self and the other, which in this context I'm reading as the public. And it's that issue that I see this project being involved in, and a kind of recognition that it's sort of implicit. You try, and when you go out with your microphone, you don't tell anybody who you are. That you kind of erase yourself and let the public, let everybody else take over, and that. Well, I'm being way more inarticulate than Bruce, but that's the issue for her. That's what I couldn't figure out. I felt Bruce's little email helped me a little.
But in a way that it's set up so that the public can't take over. I mean, he goes out and he's got the microphone and he asks them the question, "What do you think of it?" But the whole setup keeps them at I mean, there's this, you go back to that time and you talk about the public as a problem. I mean, it's very different from where we are now, clearly, and the question of reception, and there was a certain antagonistic relationship to the public that's built in a modernism, and a kind of distrust. And I'm struck by so it goes toward the public, but it won't let them get close either. It's not like you're asking them, "What do you think?" and you're saying to them, "I'm going to come back in 4 weeks or 6 weeks and see, how has your relationship evolved?" So they've got a reaction. I'm not sure what my reaction would be if someone would ask me. I don't know if I could say anything either if I were confronted with that sculpture at that moment in time. So that it set, what is the relationship, I guess the question, what is the relationship between the public, between the artist and the public that's set up in that kind of, friendly but necessarily almost adversarial relationship of the exchange with the microphone? Like, where can it go? Can it go anywhere?
Yeah. Well, you're talking, or well, what Bruce's email allowed me to do was to leave that kind of thinking and just to think about the sculpture itself, and as the sculpture, the steel thing. I saw the design, the geometry, as Garth, as this Garth's self. But then I saw the sense in which the thing was knocked over. It was horizontal, it wasn't standing up. That was the public. That was the sort of non-Garth part that made the sculpture whole or successful.
But Garth also say, in relation to the sculpture, like he asked that question, he didn't think of it as his, like to what degree is it in mine and what degree is it not, and that's like the drama of these books to him, I think, or the way I read them. So where then is the self in these sculptures, where you read it almost as a kind of self-portrait inevitably, no, or maybe not, whereas the question of the self for the work for him seems to be like in the end, during the years that have evolved, one of the fundamental questions, like who is the Garth Evans? How does this work relate to him? Even with the ways in which he sees it connected to his own history and his grandfather and his mother. So the self in relation to the sculpture is a big question, and maybe then, given that, the public itself also has to be a question. I'm not sure, but I'm. Yeah, what do you think of that, or maybe asking you to go further in terms of how you identify the work with him?
Can I chip in? I don't. I mean, this is fascinating, but I mean, and there's much I wanted to but I've left that behind. The idea that the sculpture is in some ways surreal. I'm really curious. Anyway, I wanted to chip in at this point because the 1972 transcript was turned into a play and put on here in New York off Broadway and put on again in Cardiff. And for the people involved in that drama, in that theatre, in putting it on as a play, the sculpture was being seen as the other, and the public were othering it. So for the people involved in putting it on as a play, and I was part of that. The drama was about how a public, a community, responds to something alien, or to someone alien, to someone different, and whether they're curious and in some way engage, or whether they simply reject. But one of the things that when this play was being prepared was I thought they did not need an actor to play my role, because all I do is stand there with a microphone, and don't say anything, have no lines, and really no movement, nothing, I thought a cardboard cutout would do, and the actors could come and address it. But the director cast really perhaps his best actor in the role of Garth Evans on stage, and tells you what I know about theatre, because that was key. Because afterwards the audience to the play talked about just how could this Garth Evans do that? How could he suffer? All these people saying this, rejecting his work, and what an unusual and crazy or courageous thing this was to have done. But it was an interesting switch where you're talking about the sculpture being me, but in this context the sculpture was the other.
Yeah, but what I'm trying and failing to say is that the sculpture is successful not because of particular individuals walking past it, right? But the community, the public, is in the sculpture, just as you are in the sculpture. And the mix of you with the whole world, the community, everything that's not you, those things are the heartbeat of the sculpture. Bruce brings in the word differentiation, but it's not that helpful. But when you talk about the theater, I think of that Michael Fried essay, and really Michael's sort of life work about absorption and theatricality, and what was art and objecthood on your mind in 1972?
No.
Yeah, and nowhere in these two books is anything like that talked about. That's interesting, the way you're sort of completely removed from that art world thinking. It's
Well, I think maybe from art world thinking in the States, I'm not sure. I mean, Garth can answer that, but it seems pretty clear that the work is embedded in what was going on in England. That the artists that were part of this project, I mean, you cite Bill Tucker anyway, and his concern about the autonomy and of sculpture, and the arguments about the arguments you know with Caro and Brower, Hatcher and Flanagan. I mean, that whole group. It does, I mean, Garth doesn't contextualize the work within a particular, doesn't contextualize the work directly within a set of ideas. But I can see that it's part of a set of ideas that a lot of those artists were thinking about at that particular time, and it was written about, at the time, right? So, yeah, I mean, I still understand what you're saying in terms of where the writing goes, and not talking about it directly in terms of other than mentioning general sculptural issues and the problem of the public, which is such like a big, big question, which is so deep in modernism, and was continually alive through this moment, a kind of antagonism toward the public, but wanting something from the public.
and
At
needing
the same, needing it, but also setting it up in such a way that I think that it was very difficult to get it, because if the sculpture was just put in and you go in the next morning,
yeah.
and it's just there, and it's such a strange alien thing, it's intended to be that.
Yeah.
Like, what are you going to get? But on the other hand, what Garth says he really wants is a kind of freedom, of a kind of openness of feeling and association, where people then begin to trust what they feel about it and go with it, and become more alert and learn from it. But I mean, that's part of the drama of it too, is a kind of ambivalence. On the one hand, it's a blockage, it's this aggressive thing that you can't do that much with, and on the other hand, I want you to respond to it. I want you to find some way to be at home, figuratively with it, and go with your feelings and your associations, and learn from it. And I don't know, between the aggressiveness and the hostility and the openness to a larger possibility that can come out of engagement. I mean, that's a tough part of the work, and it seems for me built into one of the issues of this kind of work, and making a public sculpture that just inserts itself overnight into like the heart of the city in a particular way. So I mean, it's a very ambivalent work to me.
Yeah. Well, it has more dimensions. The Richard Serra piece, I forget.
Tilted Art?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was all Richard Serra, all aggressive, thumb in your eye kind of stuff. But that's only half of what Garth's piece is, and it seems to me. I'm less worried about individuals walking past the thing either the day after it's installed or forever. It's the sense in which the piece brings in sort of everybody in the world at the time it was made, and but brings them in with difficulty. It's hard to see them. It's much easier to see a great sculptor making a great sculpture, and all of the focus being on the individual who made it, and how much the thing cost, and all of that kind of stuff. But how the public, the rest of the world, really mixes with, finds meaning in sculpture is it's a difficult thing, and it's behind the difficulty that I have with the books, maybe, but it's all, I'm thinking that I don't want to separate a public sculpture from an unpublic, or something you make in your studio with, you claim you're not thinking about anybody outside of it's just for you, your personal satisfaction. I don't think that, or I'm left at the moment sort of not wanting to make a distinction between public sculpture and...
Yeah, well, that's another issue altogether, I think, which maybe we need to return to. Brandt, I want to bring you into this, but I also want to add a thought, if I can recapture it. It was there, and it's just gone. It was about the idea that the sculpture is in some way aggressive, and I understand why that would be kind of felt, and I appreciate that it is to some extent that. At the same time, I mean, I don't agree that the Sarah tilted art was pure aggression. I mean, I think you could consider that, as I think Michael perhaps said at the time. I don't know whether you said it in writing, but it could also be seen as sheltering. Mm-hmm. So I don't think anything is all one thing, or very rarely. Re-engaging the sculpture and re-engaging the tape recordings, particularly the original tape recording, I began to understand, I think to some extent, that that sculpture in its simplicity and its declarative character can be seen as a sign.
Definitely.
And perhaps some of the public in '72 were responding to it as if it were a sign and questioning what its meaning was, because of that potential that it had. And so I just throw that out there. Brandt.
You did use the word stark brutality,
yeah,
and massive simplicity.
Yes.
And you did make it clear that you also wanted a work that was never going to completely adapt itself to where it was. That it was always going to remain a part.
Yeah, to that initial location, that
Right.
72 location. Yes.
I mean, stark brutality. That that still is aggressive language, right?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But to go to nuts and bolts, like a matter of form. So I think that although the piece is confrontational, it's not aggressive. It's very plain spoken, but it addresses the pedestrian one-to-one in their own space, doesn't adjust the town to suit itself. It comes out of the blue, like one night, there it is. That's confrontational. But it has two one-to-one faces at either end, both of them planar, black, monolithic. So, it starts a conversation that it basically won't speak back to. So in a sense, it's a difficult message, an unwelcome message, but it's true and fair and insightful, and it's letting people know it's not all well, and this is not all good for you. So for me, the dialogue that you have later is really poignant because you've really done your damnedest to speak to people frankly, one-to-one. And there's this issue of modern sculpture. The language is not current and common and fluent, and they have real difficulty coming back to you. You really want to hear back from them, and they have this, gulf to come over to reach you and to hear what you've said. I think the piece really lives because it's dialogic and so personal.
I just don't see where you say he really wants to have a certain kind of dialogue, or he really wants the people to come back to them with responses. I don't see that. I feel like I do think, he wants, after the work is put up, there's an immediacy, and he wants to get a reaction. But I feel like that reaction is so controlled.
Well, the piece is declarative.
It cannot really, he's not going to reveal himself. He's not going to continue the conversation. So what we're dealing with is a certain kind of reactive level, which can be very revealing in itself. But I don't know if that's an actual conversation. I mean, I feel like there's a basic, again, ambivalence, like a kind of wanting something from the public, wanting to activate the public, wanting the public to care on some level, but also not trusting them, and also not wanting to go too far with this exchange. So it has this abruptness, and I don't know how much he really wants to hear from them. I feel like if he did, then this would have been a conversation that would have unfolded over time. So he would have been there the first morning. I mean, he had to go to Minneapolis, so that's a problem. But somehow, a month later or two, like, he would have been back there, and he would have wanted to know how they would have responded to the work over time, and he would have also engaged them over time. So this question of what kind of reaction he wants, what kind of conversation he wants the work to have, that's an open question for me. And you clearly feel he is looking for more from them.
Yeah, that's some of the poignance, some of the sadness is that he can't get that back and forth going.
Yeah,
I mean, the piece is declarative. That's a difficulty.
What did I want? This is what you're asking, and I don't have a clear answer for that. I guess what I was trying to kind of learn was the extent to which this object, the sculpture, would be engaged by the people who it confronted. Would they engage it in some way that was meaningful, to them and possibly to me? And I didn't feel that they did, really.
But you also couldn't have known that on the basis of their responses the day after, what that level of engagement, or if they would have been engaged. You would have had to see the work. You would have had to have been around the work over time, and you would have had to see them.
Yeah.
How they would have, how it would have become part of the fabric of the city or not.
Yeah.
Over an extended period.
Well, that's what's so interesting about taking it back close to 50 years later and finding some people who did actually remember it, and some people for whom it had actually been meaningful.
Yeah, but that kind of meaning, it seems to me, not important. The kids who played on it in 1972 and remember playing on it, that's not as important as the miners who are being memorialized, or all the people outside of you that's that's where I'm coming from, and it's not something that you can understand, or you're trying to understand it by talking about this situation where there's a public who looks at the sculpture and responds to it in one way or another, and responds to it in a way, in the 20th, 21st century that's different from the way people responded to Renaissance sculpture, Greek sculpture. That's different from just sort of looking at the sculpture itself and thinking about it not just as the product of your genius, but the product of an engagement between you and everybody else.
But I mean, he indicates that he doesn't want the work. He didn't want the work to be a memorial.
Oh,
So no, but I'm just
yeah.
saying that this relationship between the sculpture and the memorial history is complicated and ambivalent too, because I used the word mourning. I mean, I
Yeah.
think, and in the blackness, and in the double-sided tools, and in the fact that it's a tunnel and a bridge, and it's black, so you can read into it like a history of mining. I'm not sure what, but it's certainly a memory
Yeah,
of it. But what to do with that
yeah,
memory? Like it's there, and it's profound. But Garth said himself that this only occurred to him sort of after the work had already appeared. Like it occurred to him with time. So it's like a really important part. This is his life. It's his biography. But then what is the relationship of that to the work? And that's what makes me believe in part in his going back to it. Like he had to go back because there's all this unfinished business. The work meant so much to him, but in a way at the time that he couldn't fully understand.
yeah.
So he needed over time, and he needed a different language to go back. And I think by the time he's finished the second book, I feel like he's got it. Like his relationship to his own past is much clearer. But then that begs the question of how does all this play in the actual work, in the content of the work, and how people are experiencing it at the time. What can they experience? What does it mean to engage it? There are these histories, and they're really important, but can the public get at that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm sort of with you with parts of your sentences, and it's complicated, particularly like the way you say Garth doesn't understand or didn't understand initially, maybe now understands better after really struggling, and it's not just to write a sentence, it's struggling to understand something or other that he didn't understand, and now he understands better maybe. But I'm sort of less concerned about Garth, more concerned about me, and as looking at the sculpture, right? And it's interesting to me that seeing it through this, couple of sentences from Bruce, as engaging with other people, and not in a memorial kind of way, but also you brought in this mourning business, and I've just started to read this woman, Gillian Rose, and wrote a book called "Mourning is the Law," and that's sort of part of what the sculpture is about. It's not. It's that sense in which the world we live in now, mourning is the law. And Garth didn't invent that. Garth, it comes out of the world we live in.
But back to nuts and bolts,
Okay.
and a kind of a declarative statement, which could be a conversation or not. The piece is really like a sign. The long bar, it's directional and it's following traffic, and there's a certain implicit arrowness to it. But instead, it's blunted at both ends, differently at each end. But it's a kind of obstruction and a kind of like a blunt statement of no passage and of I control, and the I think is not the artist. It's a statement about the world, about society, because this thing is happening in the street. And the message is, I control your access. I have nothing to say to you.
Well, yeah, the mix of geometry of the city with the defeated, the sculpture is horizontal. It's not standing up. It versus the sort of dynamic, clear, declarative geometry.
But it is standing up at each end.
Well, yeah, but I look at it and it's said, I want to have one end up in the air.
But
and the
why?
Other. Sorry?
But why?
Because that's healthy. That's what trees do.
So it looks like it's fallen over to you.
Yeah, yeah.
Or collapsed almost.
Yeah. And yet, that declarativeness, that clarity.
But that would make it kind of an upside down flag, like a distress signal.
Well, it would give it an anti-organic quality, and which maybe I'm wondering whether that fits in what Brandt's saying, which is that it's not going to say anything, or it can't say anything to you, like something has been sapped out. If it's fallen, a couple of people said it was dead, right? Didn't they use in one of that language comes in that it's fallen over, that whatever, that it doesn't have any kind of sap inside it, that like that. I guess that's where that's interesting to me, like the question of speech. What speech can it have, and does it seem to want to have a certain kind of speech, or does it want almost to seem to not to be speaking at all, or to say something about the impossibility of speech? I wonder, how that plays into what you're saying.
Yeah, there's a powerful feeling of frustration built into the piece.
Yeah.
Well, whose frustration? Who's being frustrated? What's being frustrated?
Well, again, I think in a way, like, as personal as it is, it's as if you've put yourself in the place of something else out in the world. And to me, it's like, it's state or corporate, the figure, the speaker. And the what could be a conversation or could be a message shared between piece and person is a message that comes from something status or corporate, which is a kind of fuck you. I've got the power. Take it or leave it. I give you a blank face and you've got no alternative. And I think it's a powerful message to deliver to the public, to say this is happening. This is where we are. And therefore it's poignant if it's not received.
Do Do you think, because there's a pretty strong reaction in the work, I mean, against some notion of social relevance, right? I mean, public art now, you know, a lot of art, it has to speak a language of social relevance. It has to go through certain processes of being in the world socially and relating to communities and being accepted by the community. You know, so I wonder whether a work like this can exist anymore, because I always want it to exist. But I think that kind of reaction against a certain platitudinous, conventionalized notion of public art, particularly what it's become now, seems to be part of it. And if you're going to react against that, maybe inevitably that's a direction you have to go into, that against a certain kind of communication. You know, a statement that maybe is more pessimistic, you know, not optimistic, although the work seems caught between the two for me about, you know, what can happen between art and the public, and what can happen between one person and another person, the possibilities of communication. Because I think you're feeling like there's a real sort of stubborn, you know, doubt, I don't know if doubt's the right word, built into this piece about the possibility.
Pessimism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's still, the fact that it exists is, you know, that's positive, or that's.
Well, it is certainly true that I would not, I don't think anybody would be allowed to do what I did in '72 anymore. Certainly not in Great Britain. I mean, elsewhere in the world perhaps, but not in Great Britain.
Yeah, but
Or here.
Or here.
Yeah, but
Probably anywhere in Europe.
Yeah, but you can go into your studio and do whatever you want. And that play between the city, the government, what you're required to do, and what you can do in private is.
But that wasn't enough for him. I mean, that was when he made the work. The idea of a studio practice was, you talked about, it was developed, you had a degree of success, but it wasn't enough. You were suspicious of it on a certain level, so you really needed to get out of the studio and understand what would happen in the interaction between your work and the world and the public.
Yeah, just that's when Bruce says the self is a phantom. That my projection is that's what Garth was feeling, and he needed to bring in something more than himself. He needed to, but he could bring that into his studio, or
Well, I mean, I don't know that precisely that, feeling that somehow or other there was something inadequate wasn't what I was experiencing so much as just being uncomfortable with what I perceived to be the consequences of my practice, the social consequences, the political consequences, the effects in the world of what I'm doing in my studio.
Yeah.
What is the effect in the world
Yeah.
of this activity?
Yeah.
Was what I was saying. I'm not sure this is what I want it to be.
Yeah.
And what is there any alternative? Is there any alternative? At this time, I was engaged with the British Steel Corporation through a fellowship program and so on, and exploring the possibility of another role for the artist through engagement with the artist placement group and so on. So
but all that's rational and with the government, with in a.
Well, it's engaging with what's out there in the world that gets engaged when you make something in your studio and you put it out in the world. What happens? What is the result? What's the ramifications?
Right, and all that's rational, but there's more to life than reason.
Well, no, I don't doubt that for a minute. I mean, but nevertheless, one struggles as best one can to make sense of what one is doing, to try to be in some way responsible for it, anyway.
But because that piece is so personal, which is this sharp-edged reason why it lives, it was also a bit obscure. I mean, you didn't know everything that you were saying at the time. More was said than you could be clear about. Mm-hmm. That's how it lives, but that's an inherent difficulty too. And for a guy in the street, for whom form is not his first language, it's got to be difficult. It's got to be problematic.
But the people on the street didn't see the work as personal at all, right?
I'm not sure that they didn't. I mean, I'm in like the most short-spoken, seemingly obvious responses. I'm not sure that they do not get it. I kind of have a feeling that in some of the throwback and the feeling that this thing has not given them something that they get and not given them something nice, they're kind of getting it. It's not a pretty picture.
So is personal, I wonder if you could say more about that, and is personal connected for you with intimate or intimacy, or is it disconnected here? Can something be, can a work like this be really personal without being intimate at all?
I think it comes, the personalness comes from an intimate place, but it's not an intimate address. And I think that like personal emotion is finding definite concrete form. So it embodies a lot of personal history, a lot of personal perspective. But it presents a smooth face. I think that piece really is, engagé and committed and more political than maybe was realized at the time, and that could be missed now. When an expectation of public sculpture is that the artist and the piece will identify with a community in a mimetic way, almost like costume, and which is almost inherently disingenuous. It's interesting that piece in that language, although, smooth, black, abstract sculpture today could almost be a genre. That enough sculptors in the 70s and since took it on that it's almost a public character that can be assumed. And yet, I see that that would be a difficult character to assume today.
Well, Tony Smith back then, Ronnie Bladen, there was a certain, language of abstract public sculpture, in this country at any rate, that did move into the realm of the generic, sort of dangerously so. But I guess, partly what I'm getting at, that there's an impersonality to that language. Like that language, like Judd's language, it's intended to leave the psychological out. And part of what's interesting to me about these books is that it kind of got left out, or it hovers in this work in a hidden way, but you really can't get at it. is that Garth, in writing the history of it, the psychological becomes increasingly important. Whereas at that time, in the making of that work, it was almost taboo. So, and so
Yeah.
what is it, you know, when you talk about the personal element and the personal being disconnected, coming from an intimate place, but that intimate place being, you know, cut off, that's really interesting. And because I think that's, as he's been over 50 years, that's what he's come back to. And that's, you know, one of the interesting parts about his writing, is that his need to go there. But then what would the public, how would that have affected the way the public would have responded then, where that really wasn't available? Where somehow you have a feeling that this is a personal work, but you can't get at that element of it. And where maybe the intimacy of it is completely cut off from you. So then what, yeah, how does that affect how they respond to it, and how does that affect what they can say? How does that affect their own
Yeah.
relationship to language?
Because both the artist and the viewer, the listener, the auditor are at a kind of impasse. They both don't have words for what they're confronted with, what they see and feel. And so the relative obscurity on the part of the speaker, the artist, is in good faith, and fair and forthright. And then it's for passing years maybe to get it understood and to know what happened then and what we felt. And
Yeah.
Yeah, two comments. I mean, first, Brandt, I think that for me, any work that I make in the studio or anywhere, it is always going to have to say more than I know. You know,
right.
That's a given. And I think that there isn't language is the point. You know, the thing stands outside of, you know, the socially agreed conceptual understanding of what there is. You know, that in some way it refuses to be adequately described, adequately contextualized, adequately brought into the everyday world in which we exist.
I'm reminded in the American scene when Henry James is in New York and the Sherman Memorial is new. He says that he thinks that it has more to do with the artist, or too much to do with the artist, that there's personal statements being made, and he says that, but really a public work of art has to be a clear-cut public statement. But if you acted in good faith as an artist, how clear-cut can it be? I mean, you really gave them everything you had, and then it's really for the person walking in to meet you halfway.
I'm not sure I know what you're saying.
I think that you acted in best faith in a moment in sculpture when personal and public were supposed to be one, and it presupposes the sophistication on the part of the audience that maybe isn't there, and something will be lost.
There's also, though, on this, there was, I remember this discussion at the MoMA on this panel like 30 years ago, and Richard Archwager took the position that he didn't want wall labels, he didn't want any form of explanation, but what he basically wanted was the public to go in, to look at the work, to confront, and that the power of the work, even the transformative power of the work, would depend upon that confrontation and what the viewer would do. And, versus where the culture was going, which is that everything has to be explained. I mean, I was caught a little bit there because I was talking, and I was thinking about Sigmar Peter, who was just so confusing for the public, and I felt like he needed something for the public to go in and address those paintings. But anyway, it was an interesting discussion, and Archwager was very much part of this generation, and there was, that belief then that there was you and the artwork. And it was almost like an existential relationship, and you had to make your way with it. And in the course of making your way with it, something could happen. And whatever happened, it would be yours, and there would be a process involved. And this could not happen if it was explained. So the idea, the idea of people, this has been true for a while. They go into museums, they look at the wall label. They look at the explanation, and then they'll look at the explanation, and they barely look at the work anymore. So I guess on some level, coming back to the pessimism question, there is faith when you put a work like that out there in the public realm that something actually can happen in the engagement of people with it. That could be transformative. I mean, you talk about wanting to, change the world in some way, and that something can happen in this interaction that does not have an explanation, that cannot happen if the explanation is there. And I feel, we're kind of caught a little bit there as a culture, because now we want everything to be explained. We want access immediately, and this is a time where there was a completely different belief in what art could be and how it functioned and how it needed to function if it was going to have the maximum effect on people who were engaged with it.
Which I think it might very well have had. And the inarticulate response is an articulate response. The words as text may not carry through, may not complete the conversation, but I think it is being had.
Yeah, well, we are, as you indicate, Michael, in a very different place now in regard to what's possible and whether it's a better place or not such a good place is an open question, I suppose.
Definitely not better.
Yeah, but there's also, Garth, you've always been Garth. You haven't changed. There's some sense in which you can see art world trends and so on changing, but just what you were saying about making sure that every piece you make has something that you don't understand in it, that impulse was there from the start, and it's different in that free, as all the. It's unfair to say all the things, and I'm oversimplifying and picking on Judd, but it's as if Judd wanted to have an explanation before he made his job in the studio was explaining what he was doing before he did it, and you are completely removed from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people like, I would think of Judd as someone kind of in in that direction and work out of a theory, work out of an intellectual sense of the lay of the land, and and make things out of that kind of thinking. I don't do that.
Yeah.
But then there are artists like, Saul LeWitt who can work out of that way too, and the work itself has a kind of, ecstatic, dimension to it. It can kind of go anywhere. So, But just one question, because you so adamantly refuse explanation, and which I'm interested in, and wondering if the work does have a certain dignity. I think there's a kind of respect that it commands, regardless of what anyone thinks of it, whether if it were explained, if it were surrounded by the apparatus of explanation, which is the way it would be now, whether that would preclude the kind of dignity that it has as a sculpture, whether that would get in the way of it, and even the kind of authority that it has, because it does have all that for me. Looking at the images, thinking back on it with time, that and that depends a little bit, I think, on what you refused.
Well,
you didn't want to.
Yeah, I mean, I've done my best to explain it, Michael. This is it. I've done my best. But as the title of Anne's essay, it's anything but simple.
But it's still, when I think about the work, I still think about it the way it was in 1972. And that was, the explanation now, it exists, so it unfolds in a different way through time. But my experience of the work is very much formed by what happened in 1972 when you made it and you put it out there in the space and there was no explanation around it. So it had this suddenness around it and refusal to accommodate itself in a certain accessible way to the world around it.
Yeah, well, I think I would still, with putting a work out now, I would still want to put it out there without attempting to explain it, even if I had an explanation, which usually I don't. Okay, I think that's wonderful. Thank you, guys. Anybody got a last word? No? Okay, well, that's it. We're done.